In September 2014, a construction worker in Wuchuan County was assigned what seemed like an unpleasant but routine job. An abandoned public toilet on the edge of town was scheduled for demolition, and before that could happen, someone needed to clean out the septic tank beneath the building. It had probably not been opened in years. As the worker began clearing debris from the thick, dark water, something unusual caught his attention. A woven bag was floating near the surface. At first, he assumed it was just trash that had been thrown into the tank long ago. But when he used a metal hook to pull it closer, the bag felt strangely heavy. Curious, he carefully opened it. Inside was a human skull. Within hours, police sealed off the area and began draining the septic tank. What they would eventually recover from the bottom would reveal something even more disturbing than anyone expected. Because this was not just an abandoned skull, it was the first clue in a murder that had been hidden for nearly 10 years. Early that morning in September 2014, police officers arrived at the abandoned toilet building in Wuchuan County. Guizhou Province was still wrapped in the quiet rhythm of rural life. Dawn had barely broken, and a thin layer of mist hovered over the narrow dirt roads that ran between the livestock station and the surrounding houses. For most of the villagers, the day had not yet begun. But for one man, work had already started. His name was Tian, a middle-aged laborer known locally for taking any job that required physical effort. Construction work, hauling goods, digging pits. If someone in the village needed something done, Tian was usually the one they called. That morning, he had been hired to clean and renovate an old public restroom located near the county livestock station. The restroom had been abandoned for about a year. The structure itself stood quietly in a small enclosed yard, surrounded by low buildings and brick walls that had weathered years of wind and rain. Most villagers avoided the place. The septic tank had not been cleaned in a long time, and the smell alone was enough to drive people away. But for Tian, it was simply another job. He began working shortly after 5 in the morning, breaking apart sections of the old wall and preparing to drain the waste pit below. The process was unpleasant but straightforward. By mid-morning, he had already spent hours clearing debris and removing layers of hardened sludge from the tank. Nothing about the day seemed unusual until he noticed something inside the pit. While scraping along the bottom with a long metal rod, Tian felt the rod catch on something soft but solid. At first, he assumed it was just another piece of garbage that had fallen into the tank over the years. That was common in abandoned facilities like this. Plastic bags, scraps of fabric, sometimes even animal remains from nearby markets. But when he stirred the object again, a woven sack floated partially to the surface. It wasn't tied. Curious, Tian used the rod to hook the edge of the bag and slowly drag it closer. As the bag shifted in the murky liquid, something round rolled out from its opening. At first, he didn't quite understand what he was looking at. The object was pale, smooth, and strangely shaped. Then the empty eye sockets became visible. For a brief moment, Tian simply stared. Inside the sludge, resting against the edge of the sack, was a human skull. Part of the jaw was missing, and several teeth had fallen away, but the structure was unmistakable. Even someone without medical training could recognize it instantly. Tian dropped the rod and stepped back. The air around him suddenly felt colder. What made the discovery even more disturbing was a memory that surfaced almost immediately. The day before, just as he had been finishing work for the evening, he had pulled up another sack from the septic tank. That bag had also contained bones. At the time, he hadn't thought much about it. There was a livestock market nearby, and animal bones were not unusual. He had assumed the remains belonged to sheep or cattle that someone had discarded years earlier. Without examining them closely, he had simply pushed the sack aside and continued working. But now, looking at the skull in front of him, that assumption felt terribly wrong. Within minutes, Tian called the police. The response came quickly. Officers from the Wuchuan County Public Security Bureau arrived at the scene together with forensic technicians. What they saw confirmed that this was no ordinary discovery. The skull in the woven sack had been lying deep inside the septic tank, partially buried beneath layers of waste and sediment. Retrieving everything required a full excavation of the pit. More officers were called in. Over the next several hours, investigators drained and searched the entire tank. What they found raised even more questions. Inside the sack with the skull were several pieces of clothing. A white shirt with the brand label Shinmen, A pair of black trousers still threaded with a leather belt that had partly decayed. A brown striped pair of shorts that appeared to have been cut short at the thigh. There was also a small crossbody fabric bag. And perhaps most intriguing of all, an old Samsung flip phone. The phone model was quickly identified as the Samsung E338, a device that had been introduced in China around 2005. Though covered in grime and corrosion, investigators believed it might still hold important clues. Yet even with these items, something was missing. There was no complete skeleton. Apart from the skull and several fragmented bones discovered nearby, most of the body was absent. The bones themselves were heavily deteriorated, suggesting they had been submerged for many years. One thing, however, was immediately clear. This was not a recent death. It takes a long time for a human body to decompose into bare bone, especially in conditions like those found inside a sealed septic tank. Based on the state of the remains, forensic specialists estimated that the victim had likely died many years earlier, which meant a terrible secret had been hidden beneath this abandoned restroom for a very long time. And until that morning, no one had known it was there. As investigators carefully collected the skull and bones for examination, a chilling possibility began to take shape. Somewhere in Wuchuan County years ago, someone had killed a person. They had hidden the evidence in one of the most unlikely places imaginable, inside the septic tank of a public toilet. And for nearly a decade, the crime had remained completely undiscovered. But the mystery had only just begun. Because when the remains finally reached the forensic laboratory, the experts would soon discover something about this skeleton that made absolutely no sense at all. Once the remains were transported to the forensic laboratory in Wuchuan County, the investigation entered a new phase. What had begun as a disturbing discovery in an abandoned septic tank was now becoming a complex forensic puzzle. The skull, fragments of bone, clothing, and the recovered phone were carefully cataloged and examined. At first glance, the most important task seemed simple: determine who the victim was. But almost immediately, the forensic team encountered something that made the case far more confusing than anyone had expected. The skull clearly belonged to a human. More specifically, it appeared to belong to a woman. The curvature of the cheekbones, the structure around the eye sockets, and the shape of the jaw were all consistent with a female skull. Based on its size, the forensic doctors initially estimated the victim's height to be relatively modest. But when they began examining the other bones recovered from the bag, the results made little sense. Some of the rib bones that had been found alongside the skull were unusually large. When the technicians attempted to reconstruct the torso using these fragments, the proportions became bizarre. The rib cage appeared massive, far larger than expected for a woman of average height. In fact, the reconstructed frame suggested something almost impossible. According to the preliminary measurements, the rib cage seemed more consistent with the body of a tall adult male, someone possibly over 1.85 meters in height. Yet the skull clearly belonged to a much smaller individual. The more the technicians tried to piece together the remains, the stranger the result became. If their reconstruction was correct, the victim would have been a woman with extremely short legs but an enormous upper body. The proportions were so unusual that even experienced forensic specialists struggled to explain them. The investigators began asking an unsettling question. Could the bones belong to more than one victim? If the skull belonged to one person and the rib cage to another, it would mean that two separate bodies had somehow ended up inside the same septic tank. That possibility would transform the case from a single homicide into something far more disturbing. But before jumping to conclusions, the police decided to consult a higher-level forensic authority. The bones were sent to a specialized physical evidence identification center operated by the Ministry of Public Security. There, anthropological experts conducted a more detailed examination of the remains. The results came back quickly, and they completely changed the situation. According to the specialists, the investigators in Wuchuan had unknowingly made a critical mistake. The skull was indeed human, but the rib bones were not. They belonged to a cow. At some point in the past, animal bones had been discarded into the same septic tank. Over time, those bones had mixed with the human remains, creating the illusion of a single skeleton with impossible proportions. Once the non-human bones were removed from the analysis, the victim's profile became much clearer. The skull belonged to a woman. Her estimated age at the time of death was between 20 and 30 years old. Based on cranial measurements, her height was likely somewhere between 1.55 and 1.65 meters. Unfortunately, the skull was almost the only intact part of the skeleton recovered. Most of the remaining human bones were missing. Whether they had decomposed completely or had been removed from the site was still unclear. This meant the investigators had very little to work with. However, one important advantage remained. The victim's teeth were still largely intact. Teeth are among the most durable parts of the human body, and even after many years, they can often provide usable DNA. Forensic specialists carefully extracted genetic material from the teeth, hoping that one day it might help identify the victim through family DNA comparison. But DNA alone would not solve the case quickly. The police needed a name. To find it, they began reconstructing a timeline for the murder. The livestock station employees provided an important clue. According to staff records, the septic tank had been fully cleaned once before, more than 13 years earlier, around the year 2000. At that time, no bones, clothing, or suspicious objects had been discovered. This detail allowed investigators to narrow the time frame significantly. If the remains had not been present during the cleaning in 2000, then the victim must have been killed and placed in the tank sometime after that year. The police focused their attention on women who had disappeared from Wuchuan County and nearby areas after 2000. The list was longer than expected. Over the next several days, investigators compiled records of missing persons. Official reports showed more than 40 women had been reported missing in the region over the years. Each case had to be reviewed individually. But even after examining these files, the police could not find anyone who perfectly matched the limited profile they had. A woman in her 20s, around average height, missing sometime after 2000. The clothing found with the skull offered little help. The white shirt brand Jinmen had been extremely common in the area during the early 2000s. Tens of thousands of people had purchased similar clothing. The striped shorts and crossbody bag were also generic items that could be found in almost any local market. Even the woven sack itself provided no useful leads. The bag carried the logo of the local telecommunications bureau. Officials later explained that thousands of these bags had been used in the early 2000s to transport promotional materials and customer gifts related to mobile phone services. In other words, the bag could have come from almost anywhere. But there was still one object from the septic tank that investigators believed might hold the key to the entire case: the Samsung flip phone. Although the device had been submerged for years, technicians managed to recover the SIM card number from the phone's internal memory. That number allowed the police to trace the history of the SIM card through telecommunications records. When the results came back, the investigators were surprised. The phone number had been registered to 3 different men over the years, and all 3 of them were successful individuals with respectable social standing. At first glance, none of them appeared to have any connection to a hidden murder. But the discovery raised a troubling possibility. If the phone had once belonged to the victim, then one of those 3 men might have known her. And that meant the investigation was about to take a very unexpected turn. At this stage of the investigation, the most frustrating problem was no longer the strange bones or the septic tank. It was something far simpler and far more dangerous to the case. The victim still had no name. Weeks had passed since the skull was discovered inside the abandoned public toilet in Wuchuan County. Forensic experts had already clarified the bizarre anatomical confusion. The oversized rib cage did not belong to the victim at all. It had come from a cow carcass that had somehow been mixed into the same septic tank years earlier. What investigators were left with was the skeleton of a young woman, likely between 20 and 30 years old. But beyond that, they had almost nothing. Without an identity, the investigation had nowhere to go. A murder case without a victim is like a map without landmarks. Detectives cannot trace relationships, cannot reconstruct a timeline, and cannot determine who might have wanted the person dead. So investigators turned their attention to the few objects recovered from the tank, along with the skull. Most of them were badly damaged by years of exposure to sewage and bacteria. Fragments of clothing had disintegrated beyond recognition. The woven bag that held the skull had no label or manufacturer marking, but one item still offered a faint possibility of a lead: the old Samsung flip phone that had been discovered beside the bones. The phone itself looked hopeless. Its casing was warped and brittle. The screen had turned opaque, and the battery had long since corroded. But phones often contain one component that survives even the worst conditions: the SIM card. If the SIM card could still be read, it might reveal the phone number that had once been used with the device. Technicians carefully removed the card and attempted to access its data. To their surprise, the SIM card still contained a readable registration number. That number immediately became the investigation's first real thread. Detectives contacted the regional telecommunications provider and requested historical records connected to the SIM card. What they discovered was complicated and somewhat confusing. Over the years, the number had been used by several different people. In the early 2000s, prepaid SIM cards were frequently passed between users without formal registration. Phones were sold secondhand, numbers were reused, and many records were incomplete. Still, some information remained. At different points in time, the number had been linked to 3 men. When investigators began examining their identities, the situation became even more unusual. None of the 3 men looked anything like typical murder suspects. One was a local businessman who operated a small but successful trading company in the county. Another worked within the regional legal administration system. The third held a position connected to a government office. All 3 were considered respectable members of the community. They had stable jobs, families, and no known history of violent crime. Even so, detectives had no choice but to follow the lead. When a phone is discovered beside human remains, every person connected to that phone must be examined. The first man agreed to meet investigators at his office. He appeared calm and cooperative from the beginning. When police mentioned the phone number, he seemed genuinely confused. After checking through some old records, he eventually explained that he had briefly used the SIM card several years earlier, but had later sold the phone when he upgraded to a newer model. According to him, the device had been sold through a second-hand electronics stall at a local market. He had no idea who the buyer was. The second man provided a similar explanation. He acknowledged that the phone number had once belonged to him, but insisted that he had used it only temporarily. When his contract expired, he had given the SIM card to a friend who needed a phone number. After that, he had lost track of where it went. The third man's connection was even weaker. He told investigators he had never owned the phone itself. Years earlier, he had briefly borrowed the SIM card because his own phone had stopped working. Within a few weeks, he had returned it to its original owner. Investigators carefully compared the timelines each man provided with the estimated time of the victim's death. The records showed that the number had changed hands multiple times before eventually disappearing from active service entirely. There was no clear evidence linking any of the 3 men to the young woman whose skull had been found in the septic tank. For a short time, detectives wondered if the situation might point towards something more complex, perhaps a crime involving influential individuals attempting to hide evidence. But as the data was reviewed more closely, that theory began to fall apart. The phone had simply circulated among different users over several years before eventually ending up with the victim. By the time the murder occurred, the previous owners were likely irrelevant. Another promising lead had quietly dissolved, but investigators were not ready to give up. While reviewing background information about the area surrounding the abandoned toilet building, police noticed 2 men who lived nearby and had prior criminal records. Both had spent time in prison in the past. Both were known in the neighborhood for drinking heavily and getting into frequent arguments. And both had lived within walking distance of the location where the skull had been discovered. Given the lack of other suspects, detectives decided to bring the men in for questioning. The interviews were tense from the beginning. Neither man was pleased to find himself sitting across from homicide investigators discussing a body found in a septic tank. At first, they reacted defensively, denying any knowledge of the situation and complaining that police were harassing them simply because of their past records. But detectives pressed them for details about their movements during the years when the murder likely occurred. Gradually, their stories began to settle into consistent timelines. Each man provided names of relatives and acquaintances who could confirm where he had been living and working during the relevant period. Investigators followed up on these statements, interviewing multiple witnesses and checking employment records. The results were disappointing. The alibis held up. Despite their criminal histories and questionable reputations, there was no evidence connecting either man to the victim or to the disposal of the body. They might have been responsible for many other things in their lives, but this particular crime did not appear to be one of them. Once again, the investigation reached a dead end. Nearly 2 months had passed since the skull was first discovered. Police had analyzed the remains, traced the phone number, interviewed several potential suspects, and reviewed the criminal records of local residents. Yet they still did not know the most basic fact about the victim, who she was. Some investigators began to worry that the woman might not even have been from Wuchuan County. She could have been a traveler, a migrant worker, or someone passing through the area who disappeared without anyone nearby reporting her missing. If that were true, identifying her might take years. But one detective proposed another possibility. Instead of searching for clues around the crime scene, perhaps they should search through the people who had once been looking for her. Police began reviewing every missing person report filed across the surrounding counties during the previous decade. They focused on women between 20 and 30 years old, matching the approximate age determined by the forensic analysis of the skull. The process was slow and tedious. Many reports had already been resolved. Some women had eventually returned home after leaving voluntarily. Others had been located in distant cities after moving away for work. But after days of sorting through files, investigators were left with 3 names. 3 women who had disappeared years earlier. 3 families who had never received answers about what had happened to them. If the DNA from the skull matched one of those cases, the victim would finally have an identity. And once the victim had a name, detectives could begin reconstructing the final months of her life. One of those names belonged to a young woman who had vanished in 2005. Her name was Afen, and when investigators started examining the details of her disappearance, one person immediately stood out in her past. A man who had once been her boyfriend. A man with a reputation for violence. A man who had quietly left town not long after she vanished. His name was Liu Taiming. For nearly 2 months, the woman in the septic tank had existed only as a collection of bones and forensic measurements. Investigators knew her approximate age. They knew she had died violently. They knew someone had gone to considerable effort to hide her remains. But they still didn't know who she was. Without a name, the case had remained suspended in uncertainty. Detectives could not reconstruct her life, her relationships, or the final days before her death. Every investigation begins with the victim. Until she was identified, the rest of the story remained hidden. That was why the missing persons files had become so important. Police had spent days reviewing reports from surrounding counties, narrowing the list to women between 20 and 30 years old who had disappeared years earlier and had never been located. Gradually, most of those cases were eliminated. Some women had been found alive after leaving home voluntarily. Others had physical characteristics that clearly did not match the skeletal remains. Eventually, only 3 possible matches remained. Each of them represented a family that had been waiting for answers for years. Detectives began contacting those families one by one, requesting DNA samples that could be compared with the genetic material recovered from the victim's teeth. The process was slow, careful, and emotionally difficult. For the families involved, it meant reopening a wound that had never truly healed. But there was no other way to move forward. The samples were sent to the forensic laboratory. Days passed. Then the results arrived. One of the DNA profiles matched. The woman whose skull had been hidden in the septic tank for nearly a decade finally had a name. Her name was Afen. Afen had grown up in the region surrounding Wuchuan County. According to the missing person report filed years earlier, she had disappeared sometime in 2005 when she was in her early 20s. At the time, her family had searched for her desperately. They contacted friends, relatives, and local authorities. But after months passed with no information, the trail went cold. Eventually, the case faded into one of many unresolved disappearances. Now, almost 10 years later, investigators were finally able to confirm what had happened to her. The discovery was devastating for her family, but it also transformed the investigation overnight. Because once detectives knew who the victim was, they could begin asking the most important question in any homicide case: who in her life might have wanted her dead? Police began reconstructing Afen's background. Friends and relatives described her as a strong-willed young woman who often lived life on her own terms. She had left home several times during her late teenage years, occasionally moving between jobs and social circles. Like many young people in the region at the time, she had struggled to find stable work and sometimes depended on friends or romantic partners for support. Her lifestyle had occasionally brought her into conflict with her family. but nothing in her past suggested she deserved the violent end she had suffered. However, as investigators spoke with more people who had known her, one name appeared again and again: a man named Liu Taiming. Liu had been a Fen's boyfriend during the period shortly before she disappeared. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. He was an ordinary local man who had worked various manual labor jobs in the area. But when detectives began asking more detailed questions about their relationship, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Several acquaintances described frequent arguments between the couple. Some of those arguments had become physical. Neighbors recalled hearing shouting late at night. Friends mentioned occasions when a Fen had appeared with bruises, but refused to explain where they came from. Domestic violence was not uncommon in the region during that time, and incidents were rarely reported to authorities unless the injuries were severe. But the stories painted a picture of a relationship that had grown increasingly unstable. Then investigators discovered another detail that caught their attention. Around the time A Fen disappeared in 2005, Liu Taiming had suddenly left Wuchuan County. At the time, his departure had not seemed suspicious. People frequently moved to other provinces in search of work, but now the timing looked very different. His girlfriend vanished, and shortly afterward, he moved away. That alone was not proof of murder, but in a case where investigators had spent months searching for even the smallest lead, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. Detectives began examining Liu's past more closely. They learned that before leaving the county, he had lived in a small house not far from the area where the abandoned toilet facility stood. The distance between the two locations was short enough that someone familiar with the neighborhood could have easily transported a body there without attracting attention. That discovery immediately raised new questions. If A Fen had been killed inside Liu's house, there might still be traces of what happened. Even after nearly 10 years, police obtained permission to search the property. By the time investigators arrived, Liu had long since moved away, and other residents had temporarily occupied the building. But certain structural features of the house had remained unchanged. One detail immediately stood out. The floor tiles inside the house looked newer than the surrounding structure. According to neighbors, those tiles had been installed by Liu himself shortly before he left town years earlier. At first glance, it might have been a simple renovation, but to experienced homicide investigators, newly installed flooring in a house connected to a missing person case often suggested something else, something hidden. Detectives began removing the tiles. What they found beneath them would become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. Because beneath the floor, investigators discovered multiple dark stains embedded in the concrete. Even after nearly a decade, the marks were still visible. Samples were carefully collected and sent for forensic testing. When the results returned, they confirmed what detectives had already begun to suspect. The stains were human blood, and the DNA matched a Fen. For the first time since the skull had been discovered in the septic tank, investigators were no longer dealing with a mystery victim. They were dealing with a murder scene, and the man who had once lived in that house was now the primary suspect. Liu Taiming had disappeared from Wuchuan County years earlier, but police soon located records showing that he was now living and working in Jiangsu province, hundreds of kilometers away. For nearly a decade, he had managed to build a completely new life, but the past was finally catching up to him. Detectives prepared to travel north, because the next step in the investigation would be confronting Liu Taiming himself. And once he was brought into an interrogation room, the story of what happened to a Fen in 2005 would finally begin to surface. By the time investigators identified Liu Taiming as the primary suspect, nearly 10 years had passed since A Fen disappeared. During most of that decade, Liu had been living far away from Wuchuan County, building what appeared to be an ordinary and stable life. Records showed that he had relocated to Jiangsu province shortly after leaving his hometown. There, he found steady work and gradually settled into a routine that seemed completely normal to the people around him. He eventually married and started a family. To neighbors and co-workers, Liu looked like a quiet, middle-aged man who simply went to work every day and returned home to his wife and children. Nothing about his behavior suggested that he might be connected to a murder investigation hundreds of kilometers away. But back in Wuchuan County, the discovery beneath the floor of his former house had changed the direction of the entire investigation. When detectives removed the tiles that Liu had installed years earlier, they uncovered several dark stains embedded deep within the concrete floor. Even after nearly a decade, the marks were still visible. Forensic technicians carefully collected samples and sent them to the laboratory for DNA analysis. When the results came back, they confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. The blood belonged to Afen. This evidence placed her inside Liu Taiming's house at the time of her death. Combined with the skull that had been hidden in the septic tank nearby, the case against him was beginning to take shape. Investigators now had strong reason to believe that Afen had died inside that house, and that Liu had been directly involved. What they still needed was the full story of what had happened on the night she disappeared. A team of officers traveled to Jiangsu province to locate him. Unlike many suspects who constantly moved to avoid detection, Liu had settled into a relatively stable life. Once police confirmed his address, arresting him was surprisingly straightforward. Officers approached him during a normal workday and informed him that they needed to question him about an investigation back in Wuchuan County. At first, Liu appeared confused. Nearly 10 years had passed since he had lived there, and the events of that time were something he rarely discussed. But when investigators mentioned Afen's name, his expression changed. It was a small reaction, but experienced officers noticed it immediately. Instead of asking what had happened to her, Liu asked why the police were bringing up something from so many years ago. Within hours, he was taken into custody and transported for formal interrogation. The questioning began calmly. Detectives asked about his life in Wuchuan County during the early 2000s and about his relationship with Afen. Liu admitted that the two had dated for a period of time, but insisted that the relationship had eventually ended. According to him, Afen had simply left town. People moved away frequently in that region, he explained, and he claimed that he had not seen her since the breakup. At first, his answers seemed cautious but cooperative. Investigators allowed him to continue speaking, gradually letting his version of events develop. The longer he talked, the more details he added to his story. But detectives already knew that many of those details were inconsistent with the evidence they had collected. Eventually, one of the investigators placed a photograph on the table. It showed the floor of Liu's former house with several tiles removed. Beneath the tiles were the dark stains in the concrete. The investigator explained quietly that those stains had been tested. The DNA matched Afen. For a moment, Liu stopped speaking entirely. The room fell silent. Detectives watched him closely as he processed the information. People confronted with strong evidence often experience a shift in their thinking, a moment when the strategy of denial suddenly begins to collapse. Even so, Liu tried to continue defending his story. He claimed that Afen had visited his house once or twice years earlier. If her blood had been found there, he suggested, perhaps she had injured herself during an argument. But investigators were ready for that explanation. Another photograph was placed on the table. This one showed the skull that had been recovered from the septic tank, along with the fragments of clothing and the woven bag that had contained the remains. The detective leaned forward slightly and spoke in a calm voice. The victim, he explained, had already been identified through DNA testing. There was no longer any uncertainty. The woman whose remains had been hidden in the septic tank was Afen, and based on the evidence collected so far, investigators were confident she had died inside Liu Taiming's house. The question was no longer whether he had been involved. The only question left was how it happened. The interrogation continued for hours. Detectives presented the evidence piece by piece, gradually reducing the space Liu had left to maintain his version of events. As the questioning went on, his answers became shorter and less certain. The confidence he had displayed earlier slowly disappeared. Eventually, after prolonged questioning, Liu finally began telling a different story. He admitted that Afen had come to his house one night in 2005. According to his statement, the two had argued intensely about their relationship and about money. The argument quickly escalated. Voices were raised, accusations were exchanged, and the situation spiraled out of control. In a moment of anger, Liu attacked her. The violence was sudden and severe. By the time he realized what he had done, Afen was already dead. Panic set in almost immediately. Liu knew that if the authorities discovered what had happened, his life would be over. Instead of reporting the incident, he began trying to hide the crime. He spent hours attempting to clean the blood from the floor of the house, but the stains would not disappear completely. Realizing he could not remove them, he decided to cover them instead. He purchased new tiles and installed them over the concrete, hoping the evidence would remain hidden. But the larger problem still remained. He still had to dispose of the body. According to his confession, Liu eventually decided to dismember the remains so that he could move them without being noticed. Under the cover of night, he carried parts of the body away from the house and disposed of them in different locations. The skull, he said, was placed inside a woven bag and thrown into the septic tank of the abandoned public toilet not far from his home. After that, Liu left Wuchuan County and moved to Jiangsu Province, determined to start a completely new life. For nearly 10 years, the plan appeared to work. The remains stayed hidden inside the septic tank, and the blood beneath the tiles remained sealed inside the house. Liu married, found steady work, and raised children. To the people around him, he appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But the discovery of a skull during routine construction work had quietly reopened a crime that he believed was buried forever. Step by step, investigators had reconstructed what happened. First through forensic evidence, then through the identification of the victim, and finally through the traces left behind in Liu's former house. Now sitting in the interrogation room, Liu Taiming had finally admitted what he had done to A Fen. And after nearly a decade of silence, the truth about her disappearance had finally come to light. With Liu Taiming's confession on record, the investigation that had begun with a skull inside a septic tank was finally reaching its conclusion. For nearly a decade, the truth about A Fen's disappearance had remained buried, hidden beneath floor tiles, scattered across different locations, and sealed inside an abandoned public toilet that few people ever thought about. What had started as a strange discovery during routine construction work had slowly unfolded into the reconstruction of a long-forgotten murder. After his confession, Liu was formally charged with the killing of A Fen. The case was transferred to prosecutors, who built their argument around the evidence investigators had gathered during the months following the discovery of the skull. The forensic analysis linking A Fen's blood to the concrete floor inside Liu's former house became one of the central pieces of evidence. Combined with the remains found in the septic tank and Liu's own detailed confession, the prosecution's case was difficult to challenge. During the trial, investigators presented a timeline that reconstructed the final events of A Fen's life. In 2005, she had visited Liu Taiming's house during a period when their relationship had already become unstable. Arguments between the two had reportedly grown more frequent and more intense. On the night she died, another confrontation escalated into violence. The attack left A Fen dead inside the house, and in the hours that followed, Liu began the process of hiding the crime rather than reporting it. The court heard how he attempted to erase the evidence by cleaning the floor, how he eventually covered the bloodstains with newly installed tiles, and how he later disposed of the remains under the cover of darkness. The skull placed inside the woven bag and thrown into the septic tank would remain hidden there for nearly 10 years, undisturbed until construction workers accidentally uncovered it while cleaning the facility. For A Fen's family, the trial brought a mixture of grief and closure. For years, they had lived without knowing what had happened to her. Her disappearance had remained an unanswered question that slowly faded from public attention. Now the details of her final moments were being described inside a courtroom. While the truth was painful, it finally provided the answers they had been waiting for. The court ultimately found Liu Taiming guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence marked the official end of a case that had remained hidden for almost a decade. But for many investigators involved in the case, what remained most unsettling was not only the violence of the crime itself, it was the long period of time that followed. For nearly 10 years after A Fen's death, Liu had lived what appeared to be a completely normal life. He had moved to another province, found a steady employment, and built a family. Neighbors described him as quiet and unremarkable. Co-workers remembered him as someone who kept to himself and rarely caused trouble. To the people around him, there was nothing that suggested he carried the secret of a violent crime. Cases like this often leave investigators reflecting on how easily serious crimes can remain hidden when the right circumstances allow them to disappear from view. If the septic tank had never been cleaned, the skull might never have been discovered. The remains could have stayed buried indefinitely, and A Fen's disappearance might have remained one of many unresolved cases that gradually fade from memory. Instead, a routine construction task revealed something that had been concealed for years. That single discovery triggered a chain of events. First the forensic analysis, then the search through missing person records, and finally the investigation into Liu Taiming's past. Each step slowly rebuilt a story that someone had tried to erase. In the end, the case served as a reminder of how fragile the illusion of normal life can be. For almost a decade, Liu Taiming had managed to separate his present from the violence of his past. But evidence, even when hidden, rarely disappears completely. It waits quietly, sometimes for years, until the right moment brings it back into the light. For a Fen, that moment arrived when a worker cleaning an abandoned septic tank noticed something unusual inside a woven bag. What he found was not just a skull, it was the beginning of the truth.